In this video, we are going to tie our discussion about the 4 types of economies with what is happening with Indigenous people in Canada today. So just as a review, what were the 4 types of economies? We had cooperation, decide together. We have custom, based on tradition, that determines who does what, who gets what. We have command economies, those in power determine who gets what, who does what, and we have competitive economies where supply and demand determine who gets what and who does what. So when we look at Aboriginal societies in Canada today, about 5% of our population are Indigenous people. Over 6,000 of the organizations, including businesses, are Indigenous organizations or businesses. So let's take a look at the Indigenous economy. Now, our Indigenous people are not a monolith. They're not all the same. So each Indigenous organization, each Indigenous group will have different approaches to things. But just in a bit more general, let's talk about how Indigenous people in Canada view the economy. So the focus of Indigenous economy really is place-based. That is, you look at your relationship to the space that you're in and to the people you are around. And there's a sacred sense of responsibility when you make decisions. And so as you make decisions, you think about 7 generations beyond you and the impact that it will have. Indigenous economies are really based on reciprocity and the nature of exchange. If you're going to ask for something, you must give something. So it's really about relationships, and that's how wealth is measured. We can look at the concept of an economy. So the Western approach that we've been focusing on, that competitive economy, really looks at accumulating wealth and rewarding in terms of performance. It looks at the necessity of competition. So it's about gaining access to resources, coming up with more efficient methods in order to gain wealth and grow your access to that wealth. In comparison to the Indigenous economies, it is very much relationship focused. So prosperity is demonstrated through distribution. Gift giving is a demonstration of wealth. There's a focus on that very circular nature of society, that is, wealth returns to you through the things that you do, and that we have a responsibility to how we use resources and to the decisions that we made, a greater responsibility, not just to our own direct relationships, our family, but to greater society and all things in general. Ooh, that went through a billion slides really fast. Let's see if we can find where we were. So when we look at the Indigenous perspective of the economy, it is a very holistic approach, recognizing that decisions are both emotional, spiritual, physical, and intellectual. So we're taking that bigger picture approach on what is done and who has access to goods and services. So we see here a representation of the medicine wheel and a number of different aspects of that medicine wheel that are used in life for the Indigenous people. Now we look at and compare the concept of wealth, right? We talked in the Western economy, that competitive economy, it represents status. And so we are amassing wealth for more individual gain, whereas the concept of wealth in the Indigenous perspective is about measuring wealth in terms of relationships. So you are wealthy if you have many grandchildren. We could look at other aspects of Indigenous economies versus Western economies, such as ownership. In the Western view, it's very individual. We want to gain ownership. We have contracts, and we're looking at who has authority over the land. And the Indigenous perspective, ownership is viewed as more collective. Rights extend across generations. There is that greater responsibility to all living things that we talked about. You could also go into responsibility. In the Western view, it's very much based on assessing risk and value creation. Whereas on the Indigenous perspective, that responsibility is passed on through generations, and there's a responsibility to the physical and the spiritual realm. And so we're looking here at the sacredness of land rather than ownership of it, but a responsibility to it. So what type of economy, if we're looking at Indigenous economies, just very generally, what type of economy would that be from our 4 classifications? Well, we said the focus was on relationships. So we can see the type of economy for the Indigenous people in Canada is very much a cooperative type of economy where things are decided together, who gets what and who does what. Now, as we look at our Indigenous people, we recognize that there is how our Indigenous people lived in the past and what has happened in terms of Indigenous people over time. So we need to recognize that there has been a number of treaties with our Indigenous people, and those numbered treaties that you can see here come from 1871 to 1921. So the Dominion of Canada was created in 1867, and as Europeans settled across Canada, a number of treaties were created. Most of these treaties then were incorporated into what was called the Indian Act. The Indian Act controlled and influenced nearly all aspects of daily life for the Indigenous peoples within Canada. It determined where people could go. So if you wanted to leave the reserve, you needed a pass. It determined what you could do, the access you had in terms of goods and services. And so living on the reserve created a lot of economic isolation because the federal government is restricting where you could go and what you could do. So, for example, under the Indian Act of 1876, reserve land is owned by the federal government. If you, as an Indigenous person, wanted to build a business on that Indigenous land, not only do you have to consider what you want to do and what your First Nations government allows or approves, but you also have a third party to that agreement, which is the federal government, the Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada. So Indigenous people don't own the land that they're on, which means it's very difficult if you want to get a loan, a personal loan, to build a house, you want to get a commercial loan to build a business. The challenge here is you can't use the land as collateral for the loan. So again, creating that economic isolation for people on the reserve. When we also look at the issue of taxation and that paternalistic nature of the Indian Act, First Nation groups were given the right to enact sales tax, property tax, to raise funds to provide services to the reserve. So like any small town, if you need garbage collection, you need access to a dump, you need to be able to pipe in water, you need to bring in electricity. Often what happens is the small towns pay the bigger towns, the bigger cities, to connect to their system. Well, the same thing is available to the reserve, but they need money to be able to pay that nearby town or city for access. So First Nation groups have the right to enact property and sales tax to raise these funds. However, the government must collect it on their behalf. So when we look at the Indian Act, it very much controls what Indigenous people in Canada can do. It is very paternalistic in nature and basically saying, you know, we don't trust you to make your own decisions, so we'll do it for you. So what type of economy would this be under the Indian Act? Right? It's very much a command economy. Well, the Indian Act hasn't gone away. Those conditions that we are talking about that you see here in this slide still hold today. The challenge as an Indigenous person in Canada is you have to make a decision for yourself. Will you live on the reserve? Will you live off the reserve? And what goods and services you have access to, what the economy looks like, is different on and off the reserve. if you are on the reserve, so you live there, you work there, then you don't have to pay sales tax, income tax, property tax to the federal government, to the province, as long as you are an Indigenous person recognized under the Indian Act. Now, there's been amendments because not all Indigenous people were originally recognized under the Indian Act. The Métis people were not part of the original Indian Act. If you live off the reserve, then you do pay sales tax, income tax, property tax. There is what's called the Williams test, which determines whether or not you get this tax exemption. The challenging piece here is that the Williams test is really not clear as to whether or not you get the tax exemption. So if you live off the reserve but work on the reserve, you pay those taxes. If you live on the reserve and work off the reserve, you pay the taxes. So really a simplification of the Williams test is that if you live and work on the reserve, then you have these tax exemptions. But these rules and complications make it very difficult to make decisions in terms of what to do with your business and in your livelihood, right? Because it's really not clear. But we recognize that on the reserve, you have more freedom to have the cooperative type of economy that is what you have done and your family has done through generations. However, that Indian Act, right, very restrictive, very paternalistic in nature, means that it's not a truly cooperative economy because the government is involved in day-to-day life. And then off the reserve, it's that competitive economy we've been looking at for Canada. So the challenge, of course, is the alignment with Indigenous cultures is more of a cooperative economy, but on the reserve, there's more of that economic isolation. We have that command component, and then off the reserve, you have that competitive economy, which may run counter, as we just looked at, to your Indigenous culture. And so the challenge for the Indigenous people in Canada is that they're straddling three different types of economies: the cooperative, the command, the competition. And it's not as clear cut as, say, other parts of Canada where we are somewhere in between command and competition, right? We decide in terms of how much laws that we enact, whether we're more command, whether they're more competition. But laws like the Indian Act that have long stood on the books have a lot more influence there in terms of how much command, how much competition, without as much involvement with the Indigenous people in terms of deciding where that line is.